All right. Welcome to the Info Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Gimmerin. I'm joined today by Rhyen Staley. Rhyen is working in education. You can find him at Rager9 on Twitter. And he's excited to explore sort of what activists are doing in education and how to help parents and others navigate that. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the information environment, but through that lens. So, Rhyen, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I just, I've left teaching. I've got over 15 years of in the classroom experience and then, working at the university level. And now I'm doing research full time and some writing. So, I'm kind of excited to be, I guess you'd say on the front lines of what's going on in our culture right now. So,
But let me actually start right there. What is it that you are researching?
well, anything that's related to the education front. So, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's queer theory. Right now, one of my big projects is focusing on tracking the money, where all this money is being infused into education, not just from the government. And so, it does take me in a lot of directions that sometimes you would think are outside the realm of education. For example, people might have started to hear about ESG or environmental social governance, which is coming out of the World Economic Forum. We're now starting to see those ties connect in with education. So while my main focus is on how things impact people, families on the ground level, I also like to zoom out and see and try to see and like what you focus on, which is making sense of the big picture. Try to figure out what is going on and why.
Okay, so to summarize it, you're an educator for 15 years. You noticed that the education system was becoming less about education and more about activism.
Hmm.
And at this point, you're looking at specifically how the network of money is flowing into education to support potentially non education topics like critical race theory, queer theory, and then the push by the World Economic Forum into ESG. That's actually really fascinating and actually connects with our topic today of the information environment. So I mean, like personally, I'd love to understand, you know, what perspective is it that you take to your information environment, and for you, do you feel like that's a great information environment? So sort of shift into our first topic here. Like, does this look like a great info environment for you?
Um, Gosh, great info environment. Sometimes it depends on what I'm looking for, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Um, what helps one is I draw upon my teaching experience and teacher training. So I have access to that knowledge base of language, what to look for, how to see things. Um, and then also I think social media is helpful. It can also be a detriment, but we can get to that later.
Yeah.
But let's stay on the positive side that paying attention to what people post, and it's not always what they post on the surface level, like what everybody's focused on. It's what I sometimes can find within that nugget of information that expands upon that piece. And we can get into some examples later on too. And especially, I'd like to hear back from you about how I can refine those skill set. You know what I mean? So
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, we can just jump in right there. So, can you give a specific example so that we can sort of hang our hat, and then I'm happy to answer questions on how you could make that better.
absolutely. So this morning, well, let me back. We did a conference in Austin a couple weeks ago in Austin. The American School Counselors Association, which governs all of the school counselors, had their conference. A couple
Okay.
of days later on Twitter, someone posts a screen capture from a session where a counselor from a school district was giving a presentation. everybody just saw that post and just kind of like ho and hum. What I did was I zoomed in on that picture and actually extracted out the teacher had put on there like what district they, or the counselor was, what district they were in, and what state, etc. So then I go to that district website and I actually pulled up that policy that they were talking about, which was related to transgenderism,
Hmm.
and then we were able to make a dispatch for the news media on that information. But again, everybody's just focused on what was being presented at the conference, and I was able to pull out information out of that piece and go further. And what we found was that school district had a policy in place that they were not going to tell parents if the school district was transitioning their child from, let's say, male to female. They also had a policy in place where if, let's say, my daughter identifies as a male, she could stay with the males if they do an overnight outing with the district. And parents would.
And then not notify parents in that
Correct.
particular district. Okay,
Correct.
so what I'm hearing is there was an event that happened. There was a screenshot from the event. It was very salient, so a lot of people were reacting to it, like as they do on Twitter and other places. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to uncover the long-term trends and
Mhm.
help parents to see the flow of money, right? Incentives matter. So obviously, if these people are pushing a particular perspective, that may be driven by the money that comes with it. And so what you did was you acted like any investigative journalist, right? You're like, okay, let's take a look at this artifact. Let's dig into it. Let's see if there's a greater story here. And then you were able to pull on that thread until you found something and then give it to your network. Is that
Right.
sort of that's sort of exactly what happened here, right?
Yep. And the other thing to think about too is, as we kind of zoom out on this, is that counselor is at the school counselors association. So she's presenting to a wide, nationwide swath of counselors. So then
Hmm.
those counselors are going to take that information and they're going to go back to their districts. So that's how this stuff, disseminates across the country into different school districts. And
Yeah.
so that's another level of this with what I do is like then I'll take those key terms from that policy and I'll start
And
to
see which other school districts have it.
correct. I'll start to do a broad search with that language. And then, sometimes it's fruitful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a dead end.
Yeah. Well, what I think is interesting is that it's sort of like a reaction and a counter reaction. So you have someone who, mimetically they go to this meeting and sort of like in the hierarchy of things, it's like one person is doing something or one group is doing something, right? And then they
Mhm.
feel like it's having an impact that's positive. So they share it person to person. And then eventually they get it institutionalized. So, for example, I am a parent. We pulled out our kid from an independent school. And part of the reason why we pulled out our kid from an independent school is that there was similar policies to the one that you're talking about, but more institutionalized. So around DEI and critical race theory. But they were actually institutionalized by the National Association of Independent Schools,
Mhm.
which creates an accreditation for all the schools that belong to it that they have to go through every 7 years. And so our independent school, as a consequence of wanting that accreditation, went ahead and implemented sort of their, you have to have this kind of person and they have to teach this kind of programming to all the different levels. And so even if we at the local school level got together as parents, because this was something that would violate the accreditation of the school was actually in many ways their hands were tied and they weren't going to say, well, we're not going to give up our accreditation. And what you basically uncovered for this in this case this the way that people feel about um, I don't even know what this class is called. Like I know critical race theory, but I don't understand what this transgenderism
It's
area
it,
is.
it's going to fall under queer theory.
Okay, if, these sort of queer theory policies is that those haven't necessarily made it into sort of like a structural document that people who are running schools have to follow. We're sort of earlier in the process where it's going district by district. Now, have you found any sort of commonalities
Yeah,
between?
so in fact, some of these are becoming more um, hard and fast. In fact, the organization I work for, we are currently in a lawsuit in Iowa over some of these policies. So what we're trying to do is set precedent, right, legal precedent that'll start to apply across the nation. But I'll give you an example. There is what a lot of school districts have. You'd be surprised that use a gender policy or a gender transition, not policy plan, a gender plan or a gender transition plan, and it's actually produced by the CDC. And in this, it's a standard document that a lot of districts use. For example, Chicago Public Schools uses it, and it it also includes in there, by the way, that if a student, by the way, can be as young as elementary level, does not want to tell their parents that they're a different gender, then the school district won't tell the parents that they're a different gender. And then they start to connect the kids with quote trusted adults in
Yeah.
the district and so on and so forth. So there is um, there are standard policies that districts have adopted more and more, and you're going to see this come about even more so now with the new Biden Title IX rules that are coming out from the Department of Education.
Okay, let's pause there and
Yeah.
sort of zoom out, because if you're a parent and you're watching this at this point, you're probably overwhelmed. And so let's talk a little bit about, what from an information perspective people can do. So there's people like you who are investigating this stuff, and of course we can talk about um, specific skills and tactics that you can do from an information perspective. But as a parent, you feel like you're getting overwhelmed with these revelations where you say, oh, the CDC does this, and then the
Mhm.
Chicago, school board district does that. And then, but I'm in Iowa. So where, like, is there, like from a sense making perspective, how are parents supposed to, get involved and get an understanding about what's happening on the ground in their area? Like, is there sort of a general set of practices that you can say, or?
I think, when we do like this summer, we spent time going around talking to parents and parent groups. So one of the things that, that we've talked about is start simple, right? Use the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, and start by just asking questions at school. Go to your school website. Some of these schools, they don't hide this stuff. They often will put it out in front. Talk to your school board members, follow the board meetings. So, I mean, obviously, the biggest thing is staying local, and I think that if we can start to get people across the country to just lock into their local environment, we can collectively start to push back hardcore against this, right? So, and then the other thing is too is there's a lot of us organizations out there that are more and more are growing to where we are doing this full time, where we're investigating these things. Reach
Yeah,
out to one of us. I
yeah.
mean,
So
you know
so if I heard correctly, it's basically, hey, a lot of this stuff is happening. um, it may not be what you're looking for as a parent in your school. Like, as a parent, I want my school to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, candidly.
Correct.
I just want my kids to be good at that. And then from a social perspective, I'd love to be able to teach them my own values, right? Which may or may not align with yours, and anyone else's for that matter. But as a parent, I want that to be my choice. And so what you're basically saying is, these people are making policy in public, and there's a number of ways at a local level to see that policy, right? Which is,
Correct.
when you're in a parent teacher conference, you can ask questions like, hey, what are you teaching? What does the curriculum look like? Can you give me a download of that? Or, you can ask your school to speak with the counselor and talk to them about what they're doing, or speak with the principal. And then the next level up with that is actually show up at the board meetings for the school board, and then read the minutes if you're not able to do
Mhm.
that, or distribute those minutes to other parents. So basically, this is a form of local, getting involved locally, like politically, but instead of in your local political machine, it's actually in your school.
Right. Yep. Yep. I agree.
Yeah.
Um, so, and the other thing to think about too is, with this is, you're not in this alone. you'll be surprised at how many more people in your town are they're not down with this stuff either, but maybe they too are either new to the information. Like you said, Michael, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
you
so
know,
yeah, like sorry to cut you off, but I
you're
think
fine, man.
this is a really important point, which is I think the reason why it's overwhelming is that many of us have turned over our responsibility to these organizations, right? Our responsibility to evaluate what they're doing. And they say, you know what? The school system's been around for 50, 100 years. It's doing its thing. I went through the school system. How bad could it possibly be? And they're really not paying attention. And what I think is simultaneously happening with the internet is that people are starting to pay attention. And when you start looking into these things, you realize just how far away it is from sort of your ideal conception. And I think that recognition is very overwhelming. And because people have sort of not paid attention for so long, now all of a sudden having it thrown in your face and seeing it on the nightly news that is the crux of the problem, I think. And that basically what you're saying is, hey, you know what? Just start looking at what these people are doing and communicating with other parents in your children's class.
Yep. And there's so many layers to this that, you you start pulling on those threads, right? And you start unraveling things. And we could talk about the colleges of education where they're training the teachers. I think when you and I grew up, I agree with you. There was a nationwide, high consensus that your teachers and administrators were trustworthy people and that you were going to school to be educated, right? Like reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that's one of the things that I will tell parents. So to the parents out there that are, well, how do we combat this? Well, if a lot of these districts, when you look at their reading scores, there are districts where it's like 11% proficiency in reading.
Which is
But
crazy because that is not super difficult.
no, and
Like
yet
you can literally
they're
okay,
spending all this time on social emotional learning and queer theory and all this stuff. No, how about we get the kids to read proficiently first? And
any parent that's reading that's watching this and that wants to teach their kids how to read, there's a direct instruction book called How to Teach Your Kid to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. It takes 15 minutes, and in 100 days, you can teach anyone how to read. They need to be at least 5 or 6 years old. But like, so that 11%, you don't even need the schools to teach that. Anyway, sorry, that was my plug for.
No, good, because I talk about that on through my Twitter presence as well about I try not to always be on the negative side. I try to be positive with what we can do, right? And that's definitely one of them is teach your kid to read. And then once they master, that's the other thing I talk about a lot too in with parents is we not only are we taking time away from the basics that these kids can't do anyway, like they can't do that. Let's focus there. Let's spend all this time, this money, this energy on teaching kids to read and do math and write, correct? Um, but once they do that, the thing is that you wouldn't need social emotional learning training because the kids' self-esteem would be established through mastery, right? That's another thing that I
It's
promote.
interesting, right? It's like by undermining the base from which their education is built on, you actually create the problem that you're trying to solve in the first place, or that you say that
Yep.
you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I kind of made a fun analogy to that, which is if you ever read the Give a Mouse a Cookie book with
Yeah,
your kids when they were little, right? And then it's a circular thing, right? And so forth. And it's the same thing with this stuff where
yeah.
it's just they create a policy, the policy doesn't work. They offer you the solution, which is a new policy. That policy doesn't work, and it just cycles around and around and around.
Yeah, and then eventually you kind of become like San Francisco homeless, where actually like paying money for the homeless actually creates homeless. Like it's
Yeah.
like the whole solution creates the problem. All right.
So anyway, yeah. So
So let's try and refocus on the information environment so people can go and follow you to learn more about this stuff. And I find it an infinitely fascinating topic because candidly, I was asleep at the wheel when I didn't have children. And then once I did and I saw all these things, I was shocked by what they were learning and actually, to your point, what they weren't learning. So, but focusing on the information environment, Ryan, how can I help, right? Like what's an area that you struggle with or that you're looking for help with or something that might be helpful to your viewers?
So one of the areas that I know that I have a difficulty with is chasing rabbit holes. And sometimes those can be really powerful. And in fact, I've found crazy things through the rabbit hole. And for people that don't understand, when I start pulling at threads, when I start looking at one thing, and then I discover, let's say I'm reading an article, and I'll discover in that article a name or another organization that I get curious about, because everything, for me, everything tends to be interesting, right? And so what I want to do is be able to refine my use of time so that I'm really digging into where I'm at, but also come up with a strategy that things that might need to be investigated do get investigated, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
then how to zoom out with that and really get a good handle on what I'm looking at.
Yeah. So one of the things, because this is what you do full time, or at least a huge part of your time, the suggestion that I have is to use mind mapping software. So, right, like there's a bunch available online. Uh, and what you basically do is, as you're reading an article, and we did this in October of 2020 for the Transition Integrity Project, which was a set of about 5 people that outlined exactly how you could manipulate an election to have a particular result. What you do is you just write all those names down, all like the proper nouns, right? So such and such person, and then such and such organization, and you make a connection, right? So it's basically a graph and edge, or excuse me, yeah, an edge and node graph, and using that mind mapping software. And then over time, a picture will start to develop. And what you begin to learn when you break out these mind maps by people and institutions, and then institutions and funding organizations, is that you'll start to see common themes. And actually, just talking about what you're doing and then showing people that infographic, like the whatever organization that's a nonprofit where you don't know where the money comes from, is communicating with these 5 organizations, and those 5 organizations are all driving change at the local level. Just seeing that 3-level map, right, that mind map, is really powerful for people, because now they can understand exactly how to disrupt these networks if they are interested in doing so. So that's my immediate recommendation, is like, step 1. You can even do this with note cards as you're reading, right? So like you'll read about a person or an entity, and you just say, like, you just write them both on the same note card, and then later you go back and you flash through all the note cards and you try to create the structure with the mind map. Like, you don't need to have the mind map open while you're reading, but you can just do it with like a list, a one-to-one list where you're just writing those together, and then go back and do it. And that can be, I think that would be very helpful. Because
How deep do you get at the first, let's say, I mean, your process as you go through that and you build that mind map, which by the way is what I just started using now for this foundation money stuff that I'm doing. So I'm glad to hear that I'm on the right track.
yeah,
But like,
yeah,
do you,
go
do
ahead.
you start with like a surface piece where you kind of map out the picture and then you go deep, or do you get deep in one area first and then you
Yeah,
map the other
so
ones out
this is a
briefly?
this is a breadth versus depth crawl problem, and people have been arguing about it in computer science for a long time. What I find is helpful in communicating to people who are not doing this every single day is to start with breadth,
Mhm.
right? So you want to try and get a handle on the size of the problem for people, so they can see, oh my God, there's 50 institutions that are doing this, right? Or actually, there's only 3 institutions that are funding this, and then 50 institutions that are implementing it,
Mhm.
as opposed to going deep and figuring out all the way down to individual policy, right? So there's a policy paper, it's written by a person. That person is funded by an institution. That institution is in turn funded by another institution, right? So that's a depth thing. Whereas you would want to go with breadth to just show people sort of how wide this software is. And I think Wolf McNally has software that helps with this. It's called like Flying Circus.
Okay.
That can be quite good. And like I said, it takes a lifetime to develop these relationships, and maybe an hour of your time to make the map,
Mm.
right? And so the other thing that you can do is, and it's funny because in a lot of ways this is just replicating web search. you could take the articles that you read and you can save them, right? And you can
Right.
print them out if you want to get old school about it, and then highlight all the proper nouns. And then just put, take the 10 best articles, highlight all the proper nouns, and then just map all of that stuff.
Why
And
would
that,
you why would you highlight and map out the proper nouns?
well, that's
What's
just
the
an easy way for you to connect like Rhyen Staley with this institution, right?
I got you, got you. Okay. So how let me give you an example of uh, angle that I'm working on here, and I kind of um, want your opinion on this. So there is a survey company that does surveys for kids across the country. They're
Yeah,
in a lot of schools.
yeah,
And Panorama Education has come under fire a year ago because the one of the founders is the son-in-law to Merrick Garland, who is the head of DOJ.
yeah.
And so so this young man created this company
I
out
think
of
Merrick
Yale,
Garland's actually the attorney general.
or attorney general, right, right. But this young man created his company out of Yale. He was originally funded by Zuckerberg to produce this programming. Now it's in a lot of schools across the country. But let's zoom in a little bit here. For example, with the state of Hawaii, they just signed a contract this summer for $1.5 million for this company to use their software. They're also have Panorama has now expanded to what they call a dashboard, which tracks student behavior, etc. Okay, so I'm gonna paint a softer picture for you here, right? Like a more surface level. This company Panorama last year got a donation from a capital investing firm of $16 million. So my question to you is, as I look at this surface level stuff, and not getting necessarily too deep on it, should I track down why did that investment firm, who's one of the biggest in the world, why would they? That's a question I end up having is, well, why would they give Panorama Ed, a school surveying company, $16 million?
Yeah. So I think the why question. So you want to start with the what first, and then
Okay.
you want to move on to the how, and then you want to move on to the why. So why is actually the third level. And I talk about this when I talk about my framework for novices, intermediates, and experts going into an information space.
Mhm.
So when you're new to an information space, you want to figure out what the rules are. And in this case, you want to figure out who the players are, right? What are the entities that are communicating with each other? And you want to map those entities. And then what you want to do is you want to, over time, see when an entity doesn't connect with another one that you would expect. That's the how, right? You want to figure that out. And then eventually you can make an inference about the why. A lot of people want to go directly to the why. So they want to say something like, the reason why we fund gender studies programs in Pakistan is that this is a really great way to launder money. That may be true,
Mhm.
but what you want to do is you want to depict the network of relationships. So in this conversation, you mentioned Panorama, you mentioned Mark Zuckerberg, you mentioned Merrick Garland. You should create a map that actually connects all of those things together. And for each um, edge that connects those nodes,
Mhm.
you should have a source for it, right? And you should be
Right.
able to figure out what it is so that later when people want to say, well, why are you saying that Mark Zuckerberg is connected to this group? You can say, well, it was reported by this group here, and I've downloaded an offline copy, right? So don't just rely on a URL not going broke or Internet
Correct.
Archive. Like actually download an offline copy and indicate, like you're a research scientist, or excuse me, a research librarian when you downloaded that,
Yep.
because there is also like people update the internet all the time, and create those maps, right? And again, it can just be as simple as I have a node, Mark Zuckerberg, and I have 3 edges that are going into my area. He put money into this, and this organization, and those organizations are connected like this. And all of those edges, those lines that connect them, you can put numbers next to them and then just have a reference list, right? And just starting there and actually allowing people to see, oh my God, because like what happens is you come into a new space and you're very overwhelmed by all the things that are happening. We talked about this earlier, right? You have the CDC is involved, the FDA is involved, the pharmaceutical companies, because they sell the drugs, are involved. And so there's studies, and then there's different school districts doing things. The whole thing is very overwhelming. But if you start mapping the relationships of all the players and then making that available to people, you'll start to see patterns, because human beings communicate and organize ourselves into patterns. And just showing those patterns does a lot. That's like, don't tell me why something happened, just tell me the facts, right? And so that's an example of that, is just show me the facts, like who is connected to whom, and do you have evidence for that, right? Like start there.
Yeah. Great. Let me highlight a couple things to support you, because I'm glad that you're saying that stuff. I'm a data pack rat. So anytime I feel like I've found something that's important, even if I don't use it right away, I catalog it. I will PDF save it.
Yeah.
And I will create a folder. I'll label the folder. I'll label that file. It takes a few minutes, but when you need to go, when something happens, let's say something pops up on Twitter and you're like, oh yeah, I have a whole file on that person, which has happened to me several times with what we're doing. And so I recommend to people too, very much what you said, which is save that as a PDF, because we're already finding, just yesterday, I think Jack Posobiec was highlighting on Twitter that they had changed that the Atlantic had changed the title of an article several times, because they're navigating that Rosary article that they produced.
Right. And of course, with all of these things, there's like a generous interpretation and a not so generous interpretation, right? So the generous interpretation is they changed the article headline because it was misleading. The not so generous interpretation is they changed the article headline because it was misleading.
But it comes back to your pattern of behavior stuff too, right? Because
right,
regardless of what the article is about, let's just say, look, they keep changing the headline, and then you can show that pattern of behavior over and over and over again, right? It comes back to, what my main background is actually coaching sports, and so what just dawned on me is that a lot of this stuff does make sense to me, like the concept map or the mind mapping, because when I would create scouting reports for my opponents, when I watched enough film, and I would use, shot charts, right? Like charts of tracking their performance. Once I had enough data, I didn't care why they did what they did. I could just tell you what they're going to do, right? Because if the ball goes here, they're just going to go and do this, right? And this kid is going to hit the ball to this location. And that, I call it a scouting report, right? Like in sports, you call it a scouting report, and why not call it a scouting report here in some ways, right? That we're creating scouting reports for people, and mind mapping is a very simple visual aid to show people this is the pattern that's going on. And I absolutely love that you've reinforced that, you have to have documentation, right? You can't just tell, because now that was my other question to you, is how you stay out of the conspiracy theory, so to speak, realm, or at least be labeled one, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's two things, because we're running up against time. The first one is that you need to have documentation, and then the second one is the magnitude of the claim needs to be matched with the magnitude of the evidence.
Okay.
So if someone makes a very small claim, you don't need very much evidence for it. But if someone makes a really big claim, you need a lot of evidence for it. And if you just do those two things, look at the relationship of entities to each other, and then look at the claims for the evidence, right? Is the magnitude of the evidence supporting the magnitude of the claim? If that's true, then you're going to be able to stay outside of conspiracy theories. And then the other thing that you need to remember, which I call the adjacency rule, is reality is never more than one or two adjacencies from the way that reality is presented. So if an event happens and the official story is X, you're not going to have the actual story be multiple iterations away from X.
Okay.
Right? So it'll be like one or two. So they'll say like, such and such an event happened. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution incident is a great example, right? So the media reported that the North Vietnamese took over a American ship in Vietnam, right? And reality is that was a fabricated story by the CIA, right? And that was what started the US's involvement in Vietnam. So that's one adjacency away from what was presented to the American people. The next adjacency would be if somebody said the CIA did that because they had already broken away from the US government, right?
Mhm.
And then the next adjacency would be like the broken away CIA is actually a front for an international cartel of bankers, right? And then the next adjacency is that international cartel of bankers is actually engaged in some kind of interdimensional um, support. And so there are spirits that are communicating through the international cartel to affect the CIA to start the war, right? And then you go one level further and you say like, these are the specific spirits that are communicating to people, right? And so what will happen is you'll start, because you realize, right, that the first link was true, that in fact the Gulf of Tonkin incident did not happen. You're like, oh, the official story was bunk, and so yeah, like, and there's evidence for it to be not true, right? Because the situation didn't happen. Then what happens is because that one was true, you're much more susceptible to making those jumps, and then eventually you're like, oh, there's a secret, alien demon that runs the world, right? And that is an example of too many adjacencies, right? Like reality as it exists is really only ever one or two adjacencies away from what is presented. And the reason for that, anyone can verify why that's true in their own lives by thinking about lies that they've told. If you tell a really, really big lie, it costs an immense amount of energy to keep that lie going because you have to maintain reality as you understand it and the reality of the lie. And the greater the distance between those two is, the more energy you need to expel. And so you'll see people who make really, really big lies. And the easiest one to see is alcoholics or people who are doing drugs for escapism. They will have these incredible challenges because they're putting so much energy into maintaining that lie. And it's the same at a societal level, right? And that's why they also say, like, eventually the truth comes out, is that you can only sustain a huge amount of energy going into a lie for so long before various, natural processes take over such that the truth actually comes out. And so when people ask me like, hey, how do you navigate conspiracies? Number one is focus on what is happening, not why, right? Number two is look at that. I guess number three is the adjacency. What do you remember what I said for number two? Actually, I kind of forgot.
No.
Okay, that's fine.
It's fine. Go back.
Number two is the adjacency situation. Yeah, so it's basically like map the entities and then understand that reality as it's experienced is not more than like one or two adjacencies from reality as it is.
Is there a reset mechanism for you where you feel like if you start to feel like, okay, I'm going too far here, and is there something that kind of snaps you back to some sort of refocus or reset?
It's the second thing, which is magnitude of the evidence.
Okay.
Right. So that was the second thing. It's like, so what are the entities? What is their relationship? What's the magnitude of the evidence to support the claims? And then to remember that reality is only ever one adjacency. So you just ask, like, okay, I'm reading about, ancient lizard people that live in Antarctica. Is there any evidence to support this? No, this is not real. How many adjacencies is this away? And I draw that adjacency where you're like, okay, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, it didn't actually happen. It was made up. Then it's like this and this and this and this. And so then you ask yourself, okay, what was actually publicly reported? And you circle it. And then you count how many adjacencies away you're at. And you're like, okay, this is 5 or 6 is too many, right? Mm-hmm. You can go and evaluate sort of 1 to 3 to see like what the reality is, but not much more beyond that.
Got it. No, I appreciate that, because that's, with this stuff, I want to make sure that I maintain credibility, right? That as I'm doing this, that I'm a trustworthy source, because I think that I give you a quick example is we hear from time to time parents talking about school districts putting litter boxes in their school, because one of the things now is this idea of called furries, which are kids that identify as animals, for example. And I've seen those pop across social media where it's a picture of a litter box in a bathroom, but I can never find actual verification that that's something going on. So as
that seems like a classic 4chan troll.
Correct. Correct. And I think that's the other thing too, is I get concerned about
Well,
being
yeah,
caught in those.
yeah. So the way that I advise, so there's a couple of things. Number one is your audience needs to understand that when you're in an environment that's so overwhelming with information, your tolerance for imperfection needs to be lower,
Mhm.
right? So this is why I don't believe in making really, really professionally designed reports that say this is happening and this is why. This is because you need like a 98% threshold of belief in order to publish that report. What you need to do is increase the variance, right? So, how many false reports you're going to publish by reducing your threshold to 70% and being much more open about it. You're like, hey, we found all this evidence. It could be wrong. One conclusion that seems supported is this one. There's other conclusions that might also be supported. And so we're going to acknowledge those and give them
Mhm.
space to exist. And when we talk about a solution to this problem, we're going to be mindful of there are multiple interpretations of the evidence, but it seems like the majority of the evidence supports a particular interpretation, right? Which is a lot less direct and formal than saying A happened, therefore B is going to happen,
Right.
right? Like you have to lower sort of your requirement, right? If you look at a lot of the big curators on the internet, they're very honest, and so there's two things that set them apart, the best ones. Number one is they have a high tolerance for the noise in the information environment, and they communicate to their audience in such a way as to let them know that there's a lot of noise. And you'll find some people directly say this, like, hey, I don't know, but this is something that I'm seeing. Or they'll indirectly say this, where they'll say, like, hey, man, I publish a lot of things. That's just who I am. If you don't like it, let me block you, right? So
Right.
there's a huge amount of noise in the environment, and you have to be understanding that you're going to see a lot of this noise, and therefore you have to lower your bar for like your evidence. So you want to be less extreme in the statements that you make, because you need to account for the fact that everything is probabilistic, not deterministic.
Mhm.
Maybe is that helpful?
Yeah. I mean, I think, what I'm obviously there's always going to be trollers, right? So I'm not concerned about the people trolling and so forth. One of the things I've found is effective is just not even commenting on stuff, right? Just put the data out there, and then show a pattern of behavior. So I have threads on my Twitter feed where one of them is ethnic studies, which is one of my focuses with what I do. And so, I'll put a little bit of, once in a while, I'll have a comment about it, but in the thread itself, it's just straight up data. This district is doing this stuff, and here are the key terms. If for example, with ethnic studies, if you see the terms oppression or white supremacy, then you're dealing with a more Marxian version of ethnic studies. And so those are the key words I look for. And that entire thread is just focused on this school district has this in their curriculum, this school district.
That's
And
exactly the right way to go about it, because it does two things. Number one is what the institutions have done is they infantilize the people that they serve. And they basically, the communication is, you don't actually know, we know better. And so we're just going to tell you what to do. And what your
Mhm.
threat is doing is you're giving people power back by saying, hey, this is happening. I'm not going to tell you like what to draw from this conclusion, but I am going to show you what's happening and you can draw your own conclusion, right? That gives people agency and responsibility, which is like a hugely positive thing. And it gives you the deniability to be like, look, I'm just reporting on what's happening. I'm not trying to make some kind of claim about why it's happening. I think this is the right move for this kind of very contentious stuff.
And don't you think that the op-ed is the place to maybe put your more opinionated thoughts out there?
I do, but I think that the op-ed has changed over time, right? So I think in the past it was a great place to share your opinions, and people would read different op-eds to try and get different perspectives, right? So they could integrate into their own perspective. And what has happened is that has led to polarization and tribalization, such
Mhm.
that I don't believe that op-eds convince anybody anymore. All they're really doing is helping to unify and focus the signal of a bunch of people that were already in agreement,
So
right?
how would you take what we've been talking about? how would you take that information, and let's say you're talking to friends who are not, and this may be too long for what we've got left in time, but um, how would you take this information and you have friends who you know are not really in tune to a lot of this stuff? By the way, we had polling that showed that 80% of the people that we polled really don't have a grasp on this crazy stuff going on in schools.
Right, right. Which is why
So,
you just send them a report that's just the what of what's happening,
okay.
right? So, like, my favorite one is to ask teachers to keep a timeline, like a stopwatch of how much time first through third graders spend in line every day,
Hmm. Good point.
right? Line to get water, line to get lunch, line to enter the classroom, line to go to the bathroom. Because you say, like, oh, what are you teaching? Oh, we teach math, we teach writing, we teach history. I'm like, great. And you also teach lines, right? And they're like, wait, what? Like, yeah, count how many minutes of the day the children are in lines,
Right.
right? And the answer is 2 hours for the average child in the United States.
Right.
So what is it that you're actually teaching? You're teaching the children how to stand in line. You're
Right.
not
And,
teaching
and
them.
with the high school kids, you're talking 5 minute passing periods. So you're talking, well over an hour a day of doing nothing in the hallways. Which is, by the way, I taught at a school where we did block scheduling, where we had 85-minute class periods, and I felt I was far more efficient with my teaching than in the little 40-minute path
Yeah, well, I
40
mean,
minute
if you think
periods.
about how long it takes to enter a flow state and then how easy it is to
Yep.
jump out. Anyway, the idea of doing
Yep.
8 different classes in a day seems absurd. But stepping away from that, I think that, like, what you want to do is you want to create a quick guide. And with the quick guide, you want to stay away from emotionally charged language that says, like, you should be upset because X, Y, and Z is happening. No,
Mhm.
you should just be like, hey, you know, here's an infographic, like a pie chart of how time is spent at school, right? And for the 20% of time that's spent on social justice, these are the key issues that are talked about,
Right.
right? And then let people draw their own conclusion of, like, hey, maybe my kids shouldn't be learning this, right? And hey, what if instead of talking about, this particular thing, we can go and focus more of that time in, like, mathematics, right? And then you can talk about, this is what's talked about, these are the outcomes that are driven. So I think, just like I said, just showing people the effect of money in these school districts, like so and so is paying for so and so is paying for so and so, just making those maps and making them available is going to be a huge thing. Because what happens is two things. Number one is, it's sort of impartial because people can't argue about it. And if you do argue about it, you can investigate it. And especially if it's a public school, you're going to know sort of
Mhm.
these programs because there's minutes and there's information about it, right?
Right.
Number two is, there are going to be a bunch of people that do write op-eds based on your maps, and they're all going to cite you. So you now become a node in the network that people go to that's trusted, right? So just by presenting factual information that's verifiable, that you can get information on, you've now set yourself up in the center of this ecosystem, and you're providing people useful information that they can build whatever uh, narrative they want on top of it, right? And if your information, the thing where you want to be consistent is, you want to consistently put out accurate as possible information that you have on just what's happening,
Mhm.
right? Like, I think where people get in trouble is that they try to be an expert too quickly, and they try to explain why something is happening. And then it turns out that's not why it's happening. And then people are like, well, your credibility is burned because you said X because of Y, but it was really
Right.
because of Z, right? And so what you should just focus on doing is just saying X over and over and over again.
Yeah. No, I agree.
To your point, until people actually know that this is what's happening in your particular area. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because I hear I've heard several times, one from people that are, like Tim Pool, for example, versus a person on the street. Same story. They'll show their friends this stuff is going on, and the friends will deny it. But I think that that's where we just have to keep showing them that pattern of, what's
Well, so that there's two things there. Number one is they'll deny it because it seems absurd, and then number two is they'll deny it because they seem powerless to solve it, right? Because there's a
Yeah.
major asymmetry between a regular parent and their school district, right? And so what you do is, you show them these things, you see potentially if they're struggling, like, hey, are you struggling? Here are ways that you can learn more about this information, and you can get involved, and you provide them an off ramp to deal with that anxiety, or
Mhm.
that sort of feeling that they get, like, oh my God, I haven't been paying attention to this. This is crazy.
Yeah. No, and that's why I enjoy doing what I'm doing, because I feel like, one, as a parent, I feel like I'm, making some difference. And one of the things I would teach my athletes and my students is, all you have to do is just make today better than yesterday, right? Or you make this next play better than the last one. And if we just keep making those small incremental steps, one individually and then one as a group, we're eventually going to start to really, make a dent in what's going on. So, that's what I really enjoy about what I'm doing is, um, I get to hopefully give a voice to these parents. And as I work with some of our, mutual friends and so forth, who are also parents, I feel like at times I get that what you're talking about. Like, it's like, I can't do anything about this, and it's like, well, no, we are, but it's just a little bit at a time here, and sooner or later, I think that we can get this stuff figured out. Um, but at least I hope so. I'm gonna be positive here.
Ryan, I think what you're doing is great. I think bringing attention to this issue so that parents understand what's happening for their children in schools, and I think giving them the opportunity to become involved, even if it's like you say, only 1% better every single day. I think this is really a good idea. And regardless of how other people may feel politically about the issue, I think bringing attention to it and letting people have the conversation of, what is actually being taught in the school, and is this something that I want my child to be learning? I think that's really noble, and it serves the purpose of the public education system and the education system at large. Really
Excellent.
appreciate having you on the podcast today.
No, man, I appreciate it too.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing more of your work.
All right. Thanks, Michael.